Yeah. We at war. We at war with terrorism, racism, but most of all, we at war with ourselves.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in
as a living testament and regulation of history in the making during our generation.
Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is
Higo, and I was an internee at the Rower Japanese internment camp in Arkansas from October 1942 to November 1945.
Haru, along with over 100,000 other Japanese Americans, whether first, second, or third generation, were sent to Japanese internment camps within the United States to ensure that Japanese spies or other threats could not harm the United States again after the horrible bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941.
I was only a 13-year-old boy during this dark chapter in American history, but I remember many of the events very clearly. After the Pearl Harbor strikes in 1941, the government started removing citizens of Japanese origin from their homes, including my own family. It was odd hearing of this attack, and I was old enough to somewhat comprehend the severity of the actions. Although I was not born in Japan, my parents were, and I could see that there was a conflict in their heads about how they felt.
Although many second-generation Japanese Americans were loyal to the United States of America alone, many first-generation immigrants who were born in Japan became very confused. There was the internal conflict of not wanting to despise their home country who had just viciously attacked their newfound home, as well as questioning how free their new home truly was because of the internment camps.
We had to leave our home once the soldiers came by, and we had about 48 hours to gather as many of our belongings as we could carry before we were sent to the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas. My family lived in Los Angeles prior to being relocated, and around 4,000 other Japanese Americans were sent to this camp, one being my best friend and his family. Now that I think about it, although these camps or relocation centers were bad, and most certainly one of America's darkest times in the 20th century, they could have been much worse compared to what the German Nazis were doing in their concentration camps. Yes, there were harsh conditions at Rower, such as extreme heat in the summer, manual labor, and poor nutrition, but the one thing that kept me through the years of internment was that I was able to stay with my family.
At each camp throughout the war, the internees were given questionnaires to test their loyalty to the United States. These questionnaires were designed to separate the quote-unquote loyal from the disloyal. There were two questions in particular that were designed for this purpose.
Question 27 and 28 were the two questions that the government really wanted answers to, and they determined what your next step in internment was. You had to be at least 17 to answer the questionnaire, so I was not old enough, but those who were not of age went wherever their parents or guardians went in general. Question 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered?" This question was bad enough because it was asking 17-year-old kids who just came out of school, as well as elderly Japanese men and women, who could be in their 80s, if they were willing to serve in the military, and if they answered no, then the government would get suspicious about them. Question 28, however, was the worst of the two, because it was a two-part question about loyalty. The question asked, "Will you swear loyalty to and defend the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?" My parents were especially offended by this question, because the government was assuming that they had a pre-existing loyalty to the Emperor, and not one to their new home. The irony of these camps was that the United States government was trying to embed loyalty into the heads of the Japanese Americans, while in reality, it was making us question our loyalty even more, because they took our homes and forced us to live in these horrible conditions.
Different things happen to different people based on their results and answers to these questions within the questionnaire. If a person answered no to both questions, they are most likely taken to a more heavily guarded camp in Northern California, such as the Tule Lake Relocation Center. If a person answered yes to both questions, they were either kept in the same camp or more frequently put in the military to serve as more manpower for the United States.
My parents both picked no for question 27 and yes for 28 because they were too old to fight, yet they knew that even though they were not loyal to the emperor, the government could do even worse things to them as well as their children if they picked no. Therefore, we stayed at the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas until it eventually closed on November 30th, 1945. My friend, however, was not as lucky because his parents picked no for both questions. His parents never had any loyalty to the emperor, just like my parents, but they wanted to stay true to themselves and therefore were sent to Tule Lake in Northern California with my friend.
As the war died down from 1944 to 1945, the Japanese Americans in the internment camps were eventually allowed to return to their homes on the West Coast. Since many of these people's properties and businesses had been neglected, or in many cases vandalized, the government felt a need to recompense for the internees' losses. The government estimated the losses in total to be around $400 million, or $5.2 billion in today's money. However, it wasn't until 1980 that Congress created the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to investigate the legitimacy and constitutionality of the camps. Also, it wasn't until 1988 that Congress approved the redress payments and issued apology letters as well. Although they were declared constitutional, the argument of whether or not these camps were is still tossed around today, making these camps a very controversial subject. All in all, however, this was a chapter in American history, and we all have to live with that, as well as find better ways to deal with national security issues.
Come and get it.